You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther. And today joining us, our recurring host, Professor Barak. Welcome. Gentlemen, I invite you all to the NCC 1701 Enterprise.
Very nice.
Sweet.
I have one of those too.
2 episodes today we're talking, and technically it's 3 episodes, but we've got some real bangers today. We're revisiting a storyline, and we are visiting probably one of the most famous episodes of Star Trek for a number of reasons, props being one of them. And I'm sure you Star Trek fans who are watching this and new fans who are watching this might even be able to guess which episode we're talking about, not just because we're going chronologically, but also because there's really, truly one episode of Star Trek that I think anybody who saw this as a kid remembers acutely. And, of course, that is the Corbomite Maneuver. Well, almost screwed that up, you guys. All right. And we'll start there. And I'm gonna break the rules. You know what? Too bad. I'm stealing Lord Uther's move here. I'm going to go ahead and rate this one 7 out of 7 warp cores right away. This episode terrified me as a kid, but it was the one thing that scared me as a kid that I could actually sit through and watch all the way because of the way the episode ended. And it's kind of like the Twilight Zone. Almost everybody who, when they think original Twilight Zone, they think of there's something on the wing, something. If you ask them to name a Twilight Zone episode, they're like, oh yeah, the one with William Shatner. Most people don't think of any other Twilight Zone episodes, except for me, who always says the one with Burgess Meredith, where he breaks his glasses in the end. There's time now. So this is the gravity of television we're talking today. And to give us some background, we're going to start, as always, with Professor Barak.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all you Trekkies here, across the pond, and way out on strange new worlds. The Corbomite Maneuver first aired on November 10th, 1966. It was written by Jerry Sohl. Sohl was a television writer. He also wrote more than 20 novels, but he contributed to the aforementioned Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Outer Limits. So he was a science fiction fantasy storyteller, and he contributed to 3 episodes of Star Trek, the original series, this being the first, and we'll go over his later credits as we discover him along the journey. I mentioned Jerry Sohl first because I wanted to take a moment and focus on the director, Joseph Sargent. Joseph Sargent straddled the line for his entire career between features and television. But he is primarily known for his success. Television, he was a sort of a workman-like guy doing TV movies and episodic shows. But his features included White Lightning with Burt Reynolds, a MacArthur biopic with Gregory Peck, and then 2 of his most notorious and successful and unsuccessful titles. He did the original Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3 with Walter Matthau and Robert Shaw, in which a New York City subway is hijacked, and they did a remake with John Travolta and Denzel Washington, I believe, a few years ago. But he did the original and is considered an urban classic. And he also did singularly the film that kind of woke me up to Hollywood for the first time. He directed the fourth installment in the Jaws franchise, Jaws: The Revenge, which was his final feature film. After that shellacking, he retreated to episodic TV again until the end of his career. But I want to take a moment really quick on Jaws: The Revenge, because as a 14-year-old, when the film came out in the summer of 1987, I had been pre-programmed to think that this was going to be an amazing big screen return to form for Jaws. It had an Academy Award winner in Michael Caine. It was set in the Bahamas. It had a creepy trailer. It even had a 30-minute behind-the-scenes featurette that they were airing before its release that I played on my VCR over and over. I was stoked. And I went into Joseph Sargent's picture on opening night, and I was crushed. I was crushed because the film was lousy. The special effects made Star Trek V: The Final Frontier look positively ILM. And I just realized that sometimes Hollywood rushes a product into theaters without care for anything more than making a buck. I know.
And it's like seeing the Phantom Menace then. Now you know how I feel.
Well, and
Yes.
that we'll debate on a future episode of The Graying Jedi. But my point being is that the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that Hollywood at the end, it's a dirty business, and sometimes you get the short end of that ticket. And so as a result, Joseph Sargent's always held a particular thing. I don't hate the man. I just think he did a terrible job on that film, and so that's always carried with me here. I am delighted to report he did a fine job on the Corbomite Maneuver from 1966. So this was the first episode that they actually shot after the two pilots that we've gone over in previous Warp Core episodes. So they did the cage, which we'll be talking about shortly. NBC said no. Then they did Where No Man Has Gone Before, and NBC said yes. And so that became the sort of, even though that was the pilot, the second pilot that was agreed to, it didn't actually air until episode 4 of this cycle that we're doing here. So they didn't even treat it as a pilot. They just shot it as the pilot, and NBC said, fine, you can make more. So this was the first episode after NBC said you can make more. And as a result, what's interesting is if you pay close attention, there's a lot of McCoy-Kirk interplay in this episode for various scenes, including a shirtless Shatner getting his physical. And once again, we get it. What's an opportunity to get Bill to take his shirt off? And they found it. But this episode basically served as the introduction to McCoy, who had not been in either of the two pilots. They ended up showing the man trap first, and we commented in that episode how the chemistry felt so natural and unforced and perfect for the core trio. But this was the first time DeForest Kelley and Shatner were trading scenes. And if you watch it with that in the back of your head, you can see that the writers were trying to sort of build out that relationship, early. And so that's why it feels like there's a lot going on between those two in terms of how they interact, and we'll get into there. This was also held until November 10th because of the FX work. This is one of the first Trek episodes in this cycle where a lot of it depends on what we're seeing on the view screens and the alien spaceships and the floating pool cue and later a giant basketball. Like, I'm not sure how those effects looked before they were digitally re-altered. I know what they look like now. And they're cheerfully 60s goofy. This is not, again, ILM 2023, granted. But for its time, I'm sure it was eye-opening for network television fans to be able to see it. But because there was such a delay, this ended up showing what was a problem with Star Trek was they had to have such a backlog of special effects that they needed to push other episodes that had more dialogue, more sets, more backlot stuff ahead because they could get those finished. So this is one of the first episodes that was delayed simply because the story they were trying to tell required pretty heavy FX work. Now, Joseph Sargent was still learning his craft as a television director here in his career. So he was introducing new things to the Star Trek visual language. Not all of them stuck, as we'll see in later episodes and seasons, but you have to give him credit for trying. He would have overhead shots in this episode and then zoom down to a character or a console or something like that. And it's camera work that catches the eye and calls attention to itself rather than just placing it on a tripod or a dolly and just sitting there and letting the action unfold as if you were watching a theatrical performance or a standard television drama. So credit should be given that in this episode in particular, we're seeing swooshes and handheld shots. Don't forget the Steadicam had not yet been invented. Fun fact, the Steadicam was actually birthed into existence by Stanley Kubrick, who made extensive use of it during his filming of The Shining. But that was one of the first times that technology had truly been embraced by a major feature. So this is, 14 years before The Shining, and they're still doing things that look sort of documentary-like at times. There's shots when Captain Kirk exits the turbo lift and goes over to the council, and we're like staying with him as if we were filming him, with a camera, like a documentary shot. So Sargent did some things that were very interesting visually. That, again, not all of them stuck. I'm sure Roddenberry was giving notes saying, nope, none of that. Quit doing all that fancy camera work. But it is interesting in this episode they do it. We talked about shirtless Kirk. I assume that's just going to be a trope that we can make fun of anytime. This is the first time we have McCoy saying, what am I, a doctor? Or a moon shuttle commander. So this should be the first time we get that DeForest Kelley there. And we have Anthony Call as the helmsman Bailey, who proves to be a bit of a headache. It's an interesting subplot in that someone who kind of maybe is an audience surrogate who's like, what are we doing out here? We're going to die. We're all going to die. Like, that's interesting. Cowardice in Starfleet, if you will, under pressure. And Kirk may have been pushing him too hard, which is McCoy's argument, which has some delicious back and forth with them, sometimes within earshot of the other crew members. They should have taken that to the ready room. But I loved Kirk's, there's a line early where he gives a typically clipped Shatner-esque response. Mr. Bailey is trying to make an excuse or something, and he's like, you're explaining, Mr. Bailey. I don't require an explanation, after giving him a direct order. And I just love that. I don't require an explanation. The score was very busy. The music also calling attention to itself in this episode. You're very aware that there's an orchestral underscore throughout the show. Like, it's kind of like, sometimes it's music just to sort of set sort of this sort of atmosphere and you're really paying attention to what you're seeing. But here you can't help but get caught up in the score. And I swear, you can hear, and it's a different composer, and it's still almost 9 years before it would terrorize swimmers everywhere. There are elements of the Jaws theme, at least some DNA of some of the chords played that John Williams would later leverage into one of the most successful horror scores of all time. But you can go back about 20 minutes into the episode and you can at least hear the faint stirrings of what could have then evolved into a Jaws theme later. Again, John Williams did not work on this episode. I would never accuse John Williams of, but you can hear it. It's definitely ambience and there. And so we'll kind of start with your guys' feel before we get to the ending that UrzaMaster so enjoyed. It's a classic story. We come up against an alien technology that seemingly is greater than ours. And for a while, there's real stakes and real tension here. Like, we don't know how the Enterprise is going to get out of it. In the back of our minds, we're like, well, they'll figure out a solution. But we're unsure. It's kind of like with Charlie X, where we're like, we know they have to defeat this guy, but since he can do anything with his mind, how are they going to... So I, for one, was on the edge of my seat a good portion of this episode, trying to figure out how they would logically resolve this question. And so I throw it out to you guys to sing praises on that kind of tension, that kind of storytelling. This is something we have not seen yet in this cycle. Again, where it's like, what do we do? We can't shoot it. We can't escape from it. How do we, are we going to be, destroyed, prisoners? And I also got a Star Trek II Wrath of Khan. Hopefully you guys will talk to you about this, where it's like you have 10 minutes to comply, and then the crew is kind of furtively trying to come up with a solution to, turn the tables on Balok in this case, or Khan in the feature. The idea, I loved the callback that Star Trek II apparently is giving it, where it's like, we better come up with a plan. We've got a ticking clock, and how do we get ourselves out of it? So you guys jump in here and tell me, because I still have more notes, but you guys tell me how you felt about Corbomite and all the maneuvering it took.
It's a trope, right? This is the beginning of the trope of, I give 2 minutes to the Enterprise and her gallant crew. This is where it all began. The time bar that, when you think about it, really doesn't make any sense. Like, you've got the upper hand, why not just destroy the enemy? Like, you always kind of wonder about that. But of course, it's to create dramatic tension. And no better is it ever done than in the Corbomite Maneuver. This is where the crew gets scrappy for the first time. This is the scrappy crew trope. Like, this is iconic Star Trek. I mean, for a number of reasons, this episode is historic. But the idea that they're sort of flabbergasted a bit by the appearance of this alien that's entrapped them, and now giving them basically a death sentence and saying, you have this much time to, make peace with your god. And it falls to the ingenuity of Kirk and, the mental sparring with McCoy, and really the whole crew gets involved. And Bailey is like the one loose thread, who, of course, is, like you said, the audience surrogate, where it's like, the audience watching this at the time absolutely was like, oh my God, Kirk and the crew are going to be destroyed. Is this the end of Star Trek? Like, believe it or not, there was definitely a time where people didn't know whether or not the good guys were going to win out in the end. You never knew what science fiction was going to do. And Star Trek embodied that. I mean, even now today, like, I can rest assured watching a new Strange New Worlds episode, like, they're not going to kill any of these characters I know that appear in the original series. It's just not going to happen. Spock is not going to stay transformed human. But at the same time, you don't really know, like, how does this resolve? And that's the real beauty of Trek. Whereas I think the graying Jedi may look at a Star Wars and say, well, you always kind of know the Force is going to be the ultimate winner. The Jedi are going to come out on top, even if the Empire does strike back. It's a tit for tat, but the good guys are going to win in the end. But Star Trek, on the other hand, puts you in these situations where it's like, you really don't know. I mean, there's really no clear indication of whether or not you're going to succeed here. And the whole idea of Corbomite and the fly-in-your-face, brazen, almost reckless bravery of Jim Kirk, this is character-defining. Like, at no point in Kirk's future does he ever not do this. But he's certainly cautious to this point. I mean, he's not reckless to this point, I should say. Like, he's definitely more a little downplayed, even in Charlie X or Where No Man Has Gone Before. All of these episodes, like, he's brave. He's established himself as a captain. He's in charge of the crew. He's their mentor, their pseudo-father figure. All these things are established. But he's not, like, unhinged brave. Like, he's very calculated. And, of course, we find out with the Kobayashi Maru later on, he is unhinged brave. He is so sure of himself, he literally will throw himself at something with reckless abandon. And I think it just time and time again, he proves himself true. And that goes throughout really all of the Kirk story that we see and have seen and talked about so far, all the way through generations, that he always knew he'd be fine if he had the crew around him. And regardless of what situation he got put in, he found a way out because he knew he was fine. I think Corbomite, just the audacity of it, but it's also a poke at the audience, right? We have our audience surrogate in the episode, but he's also like pointing out, because everybody talking at the time, I'm sure, or as they were filming, were kind of like, isn't this a little convenient? Like, there's always some like science behind it that just gets them out of stuff. Well, yeah. I mean, that's the easy answers. Yeah, it is a little convenient. Corbomite would be a very convenient way to get out of this, but it sounds really convincing because it sounds awful science-y. I mean, let's be real. This is almost Star Trek making fun of itself in a way, and I think that in and of itself becomes a trope. There are certainly episodes down the line, I think of, is it Q Who, where they end up in like the Robin Hood story, and Worf is like a merry man. I am not a merry man. It's absolutely making fun of itself, but it's taking you on a journey as well, and that's, I mean, it's just uncanny. And Star Trek started that. I don't think any other television show at that point, it really had pointed a finger at itself and said, yeah, we realize this is a little convenient, but check it out. If you believe something hard enough, it becomes truth. And Star Trek, honestly, a lot of these things have become true. Warp speed, that's something that we can quantify mathematically. We may not be able to achieve it yet, but it's not to say that there aren't people out there actively working to make this science fiction science reality. So, yeah, I could definitely talk about this all day, but I think Lord Uther's got some Gungan to add here. Oh, you're on mute, Lord Uther.
How about now?
There you are.
Can you hear me now? All right, good. So the McCoy-Kirk exchange through most of this episode was pretty tense, like you had mentioned there, Prince of Darkness, and it makes me wonder if that's what they were going for when Pulaski was on season 3. Season 3 Next Gen, was it 3? I think it was season 3.
Yeah.
Because Picard and her were always butting heads. Like they didn't get along, which maybe that's one of the reasons I couldn't stand her either for that one season. I was not a fan of her, but she was meant to be his foil a little bit on that show. She was meant to be kind of gruff, and that's kind of, I felt like that's what McCoy was a little bit at first. But at one point, it's interesting in this episode, they both. Do you want to jump in there, Prince of Darkness?
When you just said that, I thought of their relationship in the motion picture. I think Star Trek: The Motion Picture pulled from this episode in the sense that McCoy's like, I got to put this in my report, Jim. Like you're pushing them too hard, and I felt like that dynamic when they jumped to the big screen. Like I don't know, I just heard the echo of like, Jim, I'm talking about ship's fitness now. Like those two were never meant. I don't think they were ever meant to be antagonists, but this is as close to antagonism as we see, early, where he's, yeah.
But he makes the statement, and that's why I was looking off to the side, because I was actually looking up the script of this episode, because at one point, I think they're in in Kirk's quarters, and McCoy says something, and Kirk says, "You're my emotional check." It was something along those lines. Like he literally comes out and says that. Then we get the Spock part of it, because when they're on their bridge with their backs to the view screen, Spock says to him, I regret I cannot find no other logical alternative, like, to the situation. So, again, playing off the idea, and I think we see for the first time, like, Spock's my logic, McCoy's my emotion, and he always kind of checks himself against those. But again, I feel like with Pulaski and Picard, they were kind of going for that. How much work does Strange New Worlds have to do? Because now you got to bring in Piper. Oh, wait, I jumped ahead a little bit. I'm sorry, but that's all right.
Break the rules, Lord Uther.
There's still a lot of work to be done for Strange New Worlds, but that show continues to impress me so much that I have to bring it up. Plus, my head is very stuffy. Sorry, I can't help it. Last thing, and I kind of wish they would have played on this. Are there different levels of Q? Because it kind of feels like it, and it kind of seems like it. Like in this episode, you almost could have made the argument that it was Q-like, because we're going to get Trelane later on, right? What's that there, Prince of Darkness?
I said baby Q with a question mark.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because I feel like it, and then I just feel like we keep seeing these godlike beings throughout original series, and were those just other forms of Q, or could they have spin it off into something like that? And by the way, if all I need to do is have two things in my wall that I just push on with my feet to have a body like Bill Shatner, I'm going for it.
Oh, absolutely.
There was a fitness crossover right there that should have been had back in the late '60s. You know, the ceiling stairmaster, and you too can have rock hard abs like your favorite Starfleet captain. A couple of other quick notes to throw that one off. I'm still distracted by Uhura in gold. I wish the costume designer would settle on a unicolor. Again, I'm perfectly happy with her in gold, except that I know that she likes to rock the trademark red, and so every time I see her in gold, it throws me off there. And Yeoman Rand was basically reduced to ship stewardess. She served Kirk a salad, which is where I think the McCoy-Kirk reference you just made, Uther, is when she tries to feed Kirk some greens, and he rebels. And then later she brings him a hot cup of joe, like on the ship's bridge as everything is going to hell. And I'm just like, Rand, you're better than this. You're not just there to serve drinks and the occasional snack.
But I think this episode also brings up, and maybe we should have this discussion, right, about Rand, because they were obviously setting her up to be his love interest, because even McCoy's hinting at, like, you love her, and they've done that a couple of times. But didn't she have, wasn't it like a contract issue, and that's why she didn't come back for the other season?
So actually, you're only skipping ahead slightly, but in a future Warp Core episode in the not too distant future, will be Rand's last appearance, and she was actually told that she was fired right before they recorded that episode. So I've been told that her facial reactions and behavior on the set that we see on camera will be telling once we get there. But yes, they kind of just dropped her like a hot potato, and then I suppose gave Kirk the Christmas party guest of the week, so to speak. Just made it easier, I guess, including the Piper that we're going to be playing here momentarily. But I just thought this is a shame that Rand is basically reduced there. I loved the poker versus chess analogy that Kirk uses. That was the Kobayashi Maru that UrzaMaster was referring to. And I love Spock's. He kind of shakes his head disdainfully at Kirk's move, and he says, however, it was well played. And I thought that was a nice moment there for Nimoy and Shatner to get that in there. And so we're going to turn it back to UrzaMaster with Baby Baylock, because it obviously made an impression on him at a young age. Baylock was played eventually by a young Clint Howard, brother of Ron. And Clint deserves a golfer's clap, a chef's kiss, what have you. He's a dedicated character actor who never obviously became that leading man role. But he appeared in 5 different incarnations of Star Trek, beginning with this one. The original series. He later resurfaced in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, in Star Trek Enterprise, in Star Trek Discovery, and in Star Trek Strange New Worlds recently during the Klingon War episode that we saw midway through Season 2. So hats off to Mr. Howard while his brother was off acting as the Andy Griffith Show and directing Cocoon and Willow and Cinderella Man. Clint was dutifully in the trenches, just working as a day-by-day character actor, and he certainly left his mark on Star Trek, and we applaud him. And he starts off with an eye-catching and teeth-missing role. And UrzaMaster, how did young Baylock, when you were youthful, how did that grab you after all the scary stuff before?
I mean, you want to talk about like a terrible relief, right? I was terrified of the alien in this episode, like for years, because I of course saw it, I think in black and white, on an old TV set when I was very, very young. I was probably 3 or 4 years old on syndication. It was probably broadcast in color, but the TV happened to be a black and white. I later saw it in color, and it scared me more. I think I was probably 8 or 9 at the time. And that was probably around the time that the movie Mars Attacks came out. And now, understandably, Mars Attacks is meant to be a comedy, but to however old I was at the time, I had like 7 straight years of nightmares about that movie. And it was the aliens. They freaked me out. They freaked me out, and I thought they were real, and they were scary. And this was like very similar looking type alien in my kid brain. So unlike Mars Attacks, which I still cannot go back and watch, this episode I can go back and watch a bazillion times because they have this saving grace at the end where you find out it's just a puppet. It's not real. And the person behind it is like this very kind-faced, very deep man-voiced baby-looking thing. And Clint Howard, I mean, hats off to you. You took a terrified kid and like completely diffused that horror. Like I did not have nightmares about this episode like I did from Mars Attacks. I like even just saying Mars Attacks out loud, I like can feel a little chill running down my spine. But Corbomite Maneuver, no. I now remember it for the interplay of Kirk, McCoy, and Spock. The little bit of shakiness, and then the having a drink with an alien on a ship at the end. This is also the first time ish that we get a crew member, I mean, if you're talking in terms of filming, who stays behind with the alien. And echoed, of course, in the motion picture, where I think a lot of the motion picture draws on, of course, these early episodes, because it was sort of reorienting an audience who may have missed this whole series entirely to the cast and crew, of Star Trek. And I really enjoyed that part of the episode. That, for me as a kid especially, the idea of exploring space, making new friends, greeting new civilizations, like that was an idea of, like, you might feel stuck where you are and not able to break new ground or do something new that's going to excite you. But there's always time to maneuver around that. There's always time to find your out where now you're going to find fulfillment. And that, as an adult, I think is what rings through this episode quite a bit, is that, no matter where you are at right now, that doesn't mean opportunity's not just a Corbomite maneuver away. And I think that's kind of beautiful.
Outstanding. Although I loved how Kirk kind of volunteered Bailey for that. He's like, "Do you know anybody who'd be up for the mission, Mr. Bailey?" And
yeah, because I don't want you on the ship anymore.
Right.
Just
the
coward
in me would have been like, "No, don't know anybody like that, Captain." So, oh man. So, anyways,
one last thing about this episode, just real quick, because something else that kind of stuck out. Kirk declares his love for the Enterprise too, and that was part of that conversation with Rand. And he's like, "I only have one woman in my life, and that's the Enterprise. Like, I love her, right?" And so it's kind of that beginning of the two of them are attached. Like, you can't have one without the other, unless you're Captain Pike. But anyway, I digress. Or actually, I set us up for the next one.
You sure did.
Even then.
So, speaking of Captain Pike. All right, well, our next episode that we cover has quite a fan following, and even I was aware of it growing up, that the only two-parter, official two-parter, in the entire run of the original series. I'm talking, of course, about the Menagerie. In fact, an episode where it says at the end of the first part, "to be concluded." Part 1 aired on November 17th, 1966. Part 2 aired a week later on November 24th. And it was born out of necessity, not out of creativity per se. We talked about the delays and effects, and that had created a backlog where NBC was not getting episodes delivered on time as per the contract. So Gene Roddenberry, now keep in mind, we're sitting here in 2023 and we've already commented on, watched, rewatched the original unaired pilot, The Cage. But no one in 1966 had seen The Cage. It was sitting in the editor's room, locked away. So the audience had no idea about Christopher Pike and Number One and the Talos Four and any of that. So NBC is getting antsy, and Roddenberry says, all right, here's what I'll do. I'm going to knock off a script, and it only took him a week. And we're just going to incorporate large chunks of this unaired pilot, which no one has seen up to this point. NBC's like, that's brilliant, because you already shot the darn thing and we don't need to do any of the effects because you already did it. So the Menagerie really only exists because of a production delay, but it's a fascinating workaround at the time in the mid to late 60s. Like, we spent all this money, we have all this stuff, what do we do with it? And this was a great workaround that he did. So Roddenberry wrote the episode, but he wrote it twice, right? Because he wrote the unaired portions of The Cage that we see, and he wrote the wraparound story. And we're going to get into that in some detail shortly. So the two directors of this piece, part one and part two, Mark Daniels directs part one. Now, Daniels has already worked on Star Trek in The Man Trap and The Naked Time, so he's an old vet. And 85% of part one is the wraparound story. It's the stuff we haven't seen yet that Roddenberry scripted within a week. Robert Butler is given credit for part two, which uses 85% of The Cage in terms of fostering its story. Now, you do see some of The Cage in part one, but the way that they came up with the formula, they said, most of the new stuff is in part one, so we'll give it to Daniels. Most of the Cage footage is used in part two, so Robert Butler is recredited. He did not do any new work on this episode, but because he had already done the show, that's how they came to that conclusion there. Jeffrey Hunter, who after doing The Cage refused to come back to the show, he refused to come back for the wraparound stuff, so they hired Sean Kenny to physically replace him. Think Crispin Glover in Back to the Future Part 2 being replaced, if you will, by a stand-in. And he didn't have to talk, so all they had to do was put the makeup on him, put him in a futuristic-looking wheelchair, and then have him go, one blink for yes and two blinks for no, and there's your paycheck. So that is not Jeffrey Hunter in the wraparound footage. It is Jeffrey Hunter from The Cage. So, and I'm going to let Lord Uther in his comments talk about Miss Piper, played by the wonderful actress Julie Parrish, when it comes term here. But I guess, guys, it's kind of weird because we just watched and discussed and dissected and analyzed The Cage, a little over a month ago. It was actually in Warp Core episode 29, if you pending rebrand fans want to go back and check out the archives. Episode 29 is when we discussed the original unaired pilot. And they made no alterations, so to speak, of it. I mean, we literally saw the same scenes, the same characterizations, the same subplots and the like. Leonard Nimoy still hadn't settled on Spock yet, so we saw a much more, emotional and more human Spock than we're used to seeing now. But I love, this is where I want us to jump off discussion point. I love the framing story because it digs a deep hole for Spock. I mean, this isn't the jokey, we're going to steal the Enterprise in Strange New Worlds in the beginning of season 2, where it's kind of played for a little bit of comedy and so forth. And Spock's really not, he's going to get a warning, but he's not really going to get in trouble. Here he gets in trouble, right? and he deserves it. I mean, he fakes an order sent to the Enterprise, lies about it. He takes over the ship using doctored, voice logs and so forth. Like, this is Spock Breaking Bad. Like, and we see it as an audience. It's not as if we think that he's doing the right thing. It's presented to us up front as if he is fundamentally breaking Starfleet regulations and endangering the crew and his relationships with the crew by every action that he takes. And at every opportunity he gets to reverse course or see a different way, he doubles down and goes even further into his plan, which again, we still aren't revealed. Then, when it's finally the gig is up, and Kirk and Commodore Mendez are in, and their lives are in danger because of their pursuit of him, it's only then that he turns around, surrenders himself to full disciplinary action, pleads guilty, says, look, I did everything that you're accusing me of, and then in the second part of the episode, if you will, basically is found guilty by his own captain. Like, Kirk doesn't go to bat for him and be the lone holdout voice, a 12 Angry Men scenario where everyone else is against him and I'm going to still fight for my science officer. Kirk's like, you're guilty as charged. And I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the resolution of this episode, because this is the ultimate Deus Ex Machina, how they resolved it. And I was a little crushed, because I'm like, wow, they've really put Spock in a position where he has to pay some kind of price, right? He has to go to the brig. He has to be, stripped of command rank. Like, I thought that they did too good a job of making him the quasi-villain of the piece, if you will, even when we later learn that his motives were pure and all of that. You guys talked to me about this. Like, I don't want to see Spock punished. I want to see everything tied up, hopefully, with a hopeful bow and move forward. But I almost felt like they put so much on the deck of, what are we going to do? Kirk, he'll never trust his science officer again. They almost did too good a job, I guess. And then had to scramble at the end to kind of make sure everybody was okay. But this was bold. I mean, this was like, honest to God, like, I don't know how they're going to fix this. Like, he has gone so far. So, guys, talk to me about, the character of Spock in here. I think Roddenberry did a fantastic job, and I think he cheated himself a little by making it a little bit too easy and convenient to get him out of it at the end. Even though I don't want to see him, punished, disgraced, banished to Vulcan, kicked out of Starfleet, whatever. I don't want that. But I was thinking, like, they basically painted themselves into this corner. And so your thoughts on that, really the framing story, because I think we've already covered how we really feel about the Pike and the Telosians and all of that. But, man, that was some really good stuff until just the very end. The air comes out of the balloon.
I think in some ways you have to pop the balloon, right? And we saw it in the Corbomite Maneuver, and I think that's why it's nice that these are juxtaposed the way they are, is that in some ways you have to have a convenient out, right? You can't, they're not going to, like, kill off Spock yet. And I think that's the beauty of Star Trek is, like, it feels convenient, but it's just like you just buy it. You just buy it anyway, and that's like the science behind the show is so convincing. Not only do you buy it, but it eventually just becomes real. And I think for Spock here, they did a very nice job of painting him the villain. But as Kirk sees throughout, there's method to the madness. This is what would have happened had Hamlet just taken decisive action and killed his uncle. People would have found out and been like, oh, all right, he was actually the one who murdered your father. Okay, that makes sense. Like, it's still murder you just committed, but everybody kind of gets it, especially back then. They're just like, oh, hell, revenge, whatever. But it's kind of, this is where I think Star Trek kind of starts to define the easy out that everybody kind of makes fun of. And that's where, you get some of these punchlines about Trek is like, oh, you can put them in anything and they'll find a way to wiggle out of it. even if it doesn't quite make sense. And again, it's a trope, right? It's a trope of there's no way that anybody could ever be in this much trouble and worm their way out of it. But think of the Teflon Don, however you want to look at that particular moniker, whichever Don you choose, they typically do. I mean, people who really go big and bold with their breaking of rules and regulations usually get out of it in some way, shape, or form. You know, not necessarily completely unscathed, but I think Spock really, he proves his loyalty. And that's where I think Kirk is able to sort of accept this. He's like, you're loyal to your captain. And he's like, and up to this point, he's shown no indication that he's not acting always in the best interest of the ship and in his captain and his friends. And that's where you get the more compelling storyline, shall we say, of, you know, Wrath of Khan, or you know, any of the episodes where Spock truly lays his life on the line for the sake of those around him. And that's where Strange New Worlds leans into sort of the development of that attitude. And I think that's why we love it so much, is that you get to see sort of the seeds and the beginnings of Spock putting himself in a situation that no Vulcan should really be in, but because he's done that, because he's taken that under his wing and made that his, you know, thing, now you kind of you feel for Spock, like you believe in Spock a lot more, and I think that's really kind of an amazing thing. And this episode, you know, production delay aside, kind of takes a crappy situation and makes canon out of it, and that's incredible.
This whole episode, the structure of it with Spock and Kirk having to pass judgment on him, I felt more for this than I did when Spock refused to apprehend Sybok, let's say, in Star Trek V, and they get locked up in the bridge, and Kirk is, you know, furious at him for doing that and so forth. Like, that to me, on sort of a servicey level, was, you know, somewhat contrived by the oh, he's my half-brother. Like, here, I just felt like there was genuine hurt. Like, Kirk keeps looking at him like, you know, how could you do this? You know, how could you... And I love what you just brought up about the loyalty factor, because maybe it's not loyalty in this moment to who's on the bridge now, but it's loyalty to his previous captain. And I just, like I say, I was so wrapped up into it, and they did such a fantastic job that when it turns out that Commodore Mendez, he's just an illusion, like, I just felt like, oh man, come on, like, how about, you know, because I thought that actor who played Commodore Mendez did a fantastic job of being like the gruff, you know, jerk, you know, like he's like Senator Ziono in the Ahsoka episodes. Like, I don't care what reason it is, I want to throw somebody in the brig, and it's going to be you, Spock. So that's there. It was also weird that this was kind of like a watch party of the cage. They're just like, now take a look at the monitor here, and then obviously that's the only thing you could do in the 60s in terms of how you presented the detail. But it's like, we're watching them watching it, and then we're watching it, and then we come back to watching them watching it, and very meta, very meta. What do you think, Uther?
Well, I think it is all about loyalty, which was I was going to say, but I think it's about loyalty of his friendships. I don't know if it's really loyalty about the ship like Kirk might have, where it's just loyalty to his friendships, which, man, seems to be a pretty human thing if you ask me. So I think we're kind of seeing him, I'm probably projecting this way beyond what it was, but you could almost see it like him still struggling with his emotion a little bit, or it's just part of him, of who he is, being half human. Because that kind of loyalty, was that really logical to do that? Not even close, right?
But of all the souls, his is the
most human.
Human.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, another great point. And who doesn't love a Star Trek trial episode, by the way?
Here we go
Just
again.
one of many that will wind up showing up. You know, as the viewer, you always see the guy opposite of our captain as the jerk, like you know, the Commodore's the jerk and wants to go after Spock, and yeah, Kirk's kind of quiet about things, but I think he wants to see how it plays out. So, you know, I love this episode. I think actually what they did with it was genius is probably too high of a compliment. It was just great writing, and the thing we keep talking about over and over again. I mean, you've got old footage and you figure out a way to use it and make a statement out of it. Because to me, again, the biggest statement is the loyalty factor that Spock shows to Pike, which I know I'm segueing into something else because I was trying to talk about it last episode. But if I'm correct now on Strange New Worlds, they still have to replace the chief engineer, which Scotty's there, and now you've got to go through one more doctor before McCoy shows up. Does that sound right? And then we need Sulu, because we don't have Sulu yet either. So we're missing, because Chekhov shows up in TOS, but that's later on, I think.
Yeah.
Season 2 somewhere.
Right. So we still have a few more people to go here. But yeah, I think it was great.
Does this backstory, doesn't this align with Strange New Worlds, that he was trying to rescue cadets and then became incapacitated?
Yeah.
So this is an echo that they still have to do on the other show. Like they've said, he knows his fate and he's marching toward it, but it was an accident with cadets, as I recall. So, I mean...
yeah, you're right. And then they've now here's where Strange New Worlds, I don't know how they're going to work their way around this, but the Commodore asks Kirk or was it McCoy? One of them said, do you know Pike? And he says, and I quote, I met him once when Pike was promoted to fleet captain. That's not what we've seen thus far. So unless we get some kind of Men in Black moment where his eyes get flashed, they know each other very well. So that'll be interesting too.
That would be interesting. I love the moment when he's watching the Vina, the slave girl, dancing in her green, hastily applied makeup. And he actually says in the tribunal, he's like, is that Vina? And I just wanted him to say, can I get her number? He's fixated on this gyrating slave girl. Is that Vina, the slave girl there? I just wanted him to be like, how well do you know her? Is she, can I call her? So that was a...
Is she available? Are you going for that? Because mind if I do?
And I love McCoy, after realizing what Spock has done, and the security, the red shirts are standing on the bridge kind of looking around, what do we do? McCoy's like, well, confine him already. He's just just a great DeForest Kelley exasperation. Well, confine him already. What am I going to do?
I love I love his crotchety old man moments, and that's one of them, because he tends to have a lot of them.
Yes.
But yeah, it's well, confine him, man. I mean, just something like an old man would say, But it's so McCoy, and that's what makes. We've talked about this so many times, and we can talk about it again, because especially when you click like and subscribe, and you leave all of your comments below. I'm sure, a lot of you will speak to this as well, but just the dynamic that they have between each other and how they embrace the characters so quickly, as that's just who they are. Which again, that's what makes Strange New Worlds so endearing right off the bat, is they've embraced their characters and who they are. And it's so cool to see it at such an early time in the franchise.
Yes. Well, with that, we don't have to necessarily hash out the actual happenings of the cage too far. I do think it's an appropriate time to launch into our Warp Core reviews. And you all know how I felt about the Corbomite Maneuver, but how did you guys feel about Corbomite?
Oh,
Uther?
I'd go 7 out of 7 on that one. Yeah, definitely. When I was younger, creepy alien type of stuff, and then a kind of a cool way. I think almost shocking when you see it, right? Like a little kid. It's not really a little kid though. It's just another version of what an alien could look like that's flying the ship all by itself and things like that. So, yeah, I'm 7 out of 7 on that one.
And I'm going to give it 7 out of 7 because I want to celebrate Joseph Sargent the right way. and he's singularly responsible for a 0 out of 0 for Jaws the Revenge. So I feel like this will balance the cosmic scales for Mr. Sargent, who's tragically no longer with us, but I just want him and his surviving family to know that I bear you no ill will or malice. And I think you did a bang-up job on a formative episode of the original Star Trek. So here, you hit a home run. That's right. And we'll talk about Mario Van Peebles and the Jamaican accent in a completely different setting, I'm sure. So.
Oh, Mario Van Peebles, the sorcerer. So we have to talk the Menagerie, right? I think we treat this as it's one episode, even though it's 2 parts, because we've already talked the cage, but this episode, as we've talked, is way, way more than just a rehash of the cage. It really does build a lot of what we see in later episodes and in the films. So that knowledge being discussed, Professor Barak, how did you feel about the Menagerie?
Well, if you go back again to Warp Core episode 29, you will see that I gave the cage a 4 out of 7 warp cores because I found it parts of it to be just a little bit too hammy. I thought that the wraparound story in this 2-parter was 99% extraordinary and 1% gee whiz. So I think when you counterbalance the two, you come up with I think that the good outweighs the bad, and the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So I think it pulls it up to about a 6. It lifts the cage upward, and the cage's 4 drags the 7 downward slightly, but not enough to really make it meaningful. So I'm going to go 6 on the Menagerie. I would give it a 7 if I was a 1966 viewer and had never seen the cage and said, wow, what a great way to solve the problem. But if this was 1966, then we'd have a hard time coming to you on pending rebrand, I think, in terms of the overall technology. So we'll make it a 6, and we'll say that Roddenberry, you had me at everything but goodbye in terms of that one.
I apologize, everyone, for coughing into the microphone. I'm still slightly ill. I'm going... Yeah, too bad. I'm going 7 out of 7 because I am all about loyalty, number 1. And number 2, I just think it's pretty... I think it says a lot. To know that it was only written in a week, I think that's pretty darn impressive, too, to be able to have that kind of cohesion and get that story to work with that original footage. And again, I think there's a lot of... I think there's some setup for what we're going to see from these characters in the future. So I'm going 7 out of 7 because again, I know there are some episodes coming up that not going to get a 7 out of 7. But I'm going 7 out of 7.
I too will go 7 out of 7. This again was a formative Star Trek experience for me. I saw this episode and very shortly thereafter saw Wrath of Khan for the first time. So this, to me, represents the best of Star Trek. The Spock story here, very reminiscent of Wrath of Khan. And I think the loyalty story is huge. I really, really love what they've done with the characters. And to know that it was written in a week is just outstanding. I mean, truly. The frame story, I think, elevates the original, The Cage, which I liked, but obviously did not give anywhere near a 7 out of 7. But I do think that what they were able to do, it's a little reminiscent of that Albatross kind of thing, and I really enjoyed the way that they constructed a Spock we haven't seen yet, but a Spock that definitely impacts the rest of the series, and the idea that Spock has secrets, despite his logic and his, shall we say, green-blooded nature, just really highlights the mystery of Spock, and I think the relationship between the core trio is established pretty firmly here. That like I said, it's one of those that lays the foundation for all of what the TOS arcs are henceforth. So I can't deny history, and it definitely is a retroactive thing. I think the first time I saw it, it was not a 7 out of 7, but now that I've seen virtually all of Star Trek's offerings, yeah, it's there. So, gentlemen, this has been our 34th episode of the Warp Core podcast.
Oh, Berkeley.
Whoo-wee! We got to say thank you to our loyal listeners, loyal fans here at Pending Rebrand on YouTube. Make sure if you haven't already, and I know 94% of you out there have not, hit that subscribe button. Drop us a like if you enjoyed the episode, and if you have anything to say about any of what we've talked about in this episode, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment here in YouTube. If you're watching this from a Facebook posting, that's great too, but it really helps us out, and we want to talk about your comments live on the podcast. They got to go into YouTube so we can all see them, we can all talk about them. What are your thoughts? Did you want to see more of Pike being tortured as though he were in hell? Did you want to see Spock get punished? Did you want to see some more Yeoman Rand in the series? Just let us know in those comments, and we will read them, and we will name you. Name drop on a podcast. Who can beat that? And don't be afraid. Check out our other shows here at Pending Rebrand. We've got The Graying Jedi, where we talk Star Wars every week. We've got Cut the Cheese, Poke the Bear, where we talk NFL football every week. And coming soon, new episodes of the Melt Off Podcast featuring myself and Goonie Mama. And if you like food, that might be a way to learn a little bit. I thank you. UrzaMaster. Lord Uther, thank you for joining. And Professor Barak, as always, thank you for guesting with us. Although I think at this point, let's be real, APC is with us for good. I wish you all a happy, happy day. Whatever day you happen to be watching this, hopefully later today or sometime in the future. Until then, live long and prosper.